And joining us now is Tom Gross. He's a Middle East expert joining us live from Tel Aviv, Israel, to talk to us further about Israeli politics. Good afternoon, Tom. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Good afternoon.
Now, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett appealed for more open support from what he described as Israel's silent majority as he marked a year in office with his governing coalition tenuously controlling half the seats in Parliament. Now, how was this first year for Prime Minister Naftali Bennett?
Well, I mean, some people would say it's a success just for surviving an entire year at all. I mean, this is the most diverse and narrow coalition in Israeli history. And in fact, I think it's probably one of the most diverse coalitions ever formed in any country in peacetime that I can think of anywhere in the world. I mean, you have 8 different parties. None of the parties are that big. You have fundamentally different kinds of people with very different views. You have religious, right-wing Israeli West Bank settlers. You have left-wing gay rights activists and feminists. You have conservative Arab Islamists. And in spite of this, they've actually worked relatively well and actually done quite a lot in a way, not particularly on the international stage, but domestically they got an important budget passed. They've made some important economic reforms, for example, to imports to Israel. They've changed laws in the ports, which will see a lot of price reduction as bureaucracy is slashed and prices are lowered from everything from carpets to tampons to washing machines. They have done some environmental reform. They've taxed sugary drinks, which will bring down diabetes and so on. They're expanding the railway network in Israel. So none of this is very exciting for international viewers, but they've brought about a measure of calm, and also because Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister, has a much less abrasive personality than Benjamin Netanyahu, who he took over from, and who is again ahead in the polls and is very likely to make a comeback if there is a snap election.
OK. All right. Now, Israel's PM Bennett lost a majority after an MP quit coalition. Israel's Lapid courts, Arab parties have an eye for an early election. Can the next step possibly be early elections in Israel, or can there be a new coalition established?
I think a new coalition is very, very unlikely. There are simply too many different parties. As was mentioned, the present government has 60 members of Knesset. The opposition parties also have 60, but the opposition parties have some quite radical Arab parties, and they include right-wing parties, both Netanyahu's Likud party and parties to the right of Likud. I can't see those groupings forming a coalition. On the other hand, the existing coalition is hemorrhaging support. They've already lost 1 member of Knesset, and 3 or 4 others are threatening to quit this month. So it will be remarkable if this government lasts, and it will also be remarkable if a new coalition is put into place. And it looks increasingly likely that Netanyahu will make a comeback. Although, you know, a week is a long time in politics, as they say. It takes months to actually hold elections in Israel because of the logistical problems of dissolving governments and planning new elections, and then there'll be coalition wrangling after elections. I mean, the paradoxical thing about Israel is, in the one hand, it's very democratic and has actually a very simple electoral system where it's very easy to form a party, cross the relatively low threshold and get into power, which is why there are so many different parties in government. Every different faction in Israeli society, every different demographic group seems to have its own political parties in the Knesset. So on one hand, it's very democratic. On the other hand, it leads to a kind of absolute gridlock and stalemate, which is why it's remarkable this coalition has even lasted a year, even though, you know, I mentioned some of the successes. There are other ones too. For example, today the EU President Ursula von der Leyen is in Jerusalem negotiating a major new gas agreement between the European Union, Israel and Egypt. So Israel may supply gas via Egypt to the EU to make up for some of the lost gas that came from Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So things continue. There are nationalist parades last week in Israel, but there were also big gay pride parades in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, were particularly large and successful this year. But in spite of this successes they can point to, I think there will be elections, and there's every likelihood that Benjamin Netanyahu, who has already served 4 terms as Prime Minister, Israel's longest lasting Prime Minister, and is now aged about 72, when the dust settles, there's every chance that he will again become Prime Minister.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. It's always a pleasure talking to you.